The rules of encryption are quite simple. Unfortunately, nobody is following them, but they are quite simple. The rules of encryption are this. First, every record must be stored and encrypted with its own key, and each key must be stored on a separate server. If you do those two simple things, you win. Now, here's the irony of it. If we look at all of the data breaches that have happened over the last 5 years, what do they all have in common? What they all have in common is all the records were encrypted with the same key, and the key was stored plain text on the server. Now, if we want to make the rules of encryption even simpler, we could even say the most important rule is never store your key on the same server. Because even though you shouldn't, technically, even if the records were stored with similar or the same keys, if the attacker couldn't get the key, they still couldn't encrypt the data. So really the fundamental, most important rule, if you're implementing any cryptographic solution, is where are the keys stored? The keys must be stored on a separate server. The keys can never be stored with the data. They can never be stored plain text, and they can never be easily accessible with the data. Your keys must be separate, protected, and isolated. Then, because there's a risk that somebody might be able to get one or two keys, the second component to add on to that is we want to have each of our records encrypted with separate keys. Now, I know this sounds very simple, but unfortunately, this is not something anyone is talking about. After major data breaches, they talk about configuration management and patching. Nobody is talking about key management. So it's real simple. Any cryptographic solution that you're deploying if you're a consultant, or any cryptographic solution that's in your organization if you're a security engineer or a CISO, you need to go back and check two simple things. Are each of the records encrypted with separate keys? And are the keys stored on a separate server? If you do those two things, you win. If you don't do those two things, you lose. And unfortunately, all of the major data breaches of all of the major companies that we have seen over the last 5 years have failed to do those two critical steps. So check two things. Are your records encrypted with different keys? And are your keys stored on separate servers? And if you do those two things, you win at this game of encryption.